Every portrait hides the truth. In the Victorian age, a widow's veil was more than cloth. It was a curtain between the world and her secrets. To her neighbours, it shielded grief. But sometimes, it shielded sins. She walked the same path each morning, her black gown sweeping across the cobblestones, her prayers whispered over a husband's grave. She wept when others were watching, and her hands folded neatly in sorrow. Yet behind the locked brass clasp of a trunk, hidden in her parlour, lay another story. A collection of letters inked with passion, betrayal, and a legacy written in silence. Her town believed she was a saint of sorrow. History revealed she was something else entirely. This is the widow's secret. The world may turn away, but the candle never lies. It gives light to the truth. Welcome to my Candlelight Confessions. In a small Victorian town where the streets were lined with iron lampposts and every parlour smelled faintly of coal smoke and lavender, she lived in a stately brick home with lace curtains drawn tightly shut. Her black veil hung on the back of a chair, as though it had become part of the furniture itself. Neighbours would pass by and say, "That poor soul, she still mourns her husband," and they admired her for it. In the 1800s, widowhood carried with it a sacred duty. Society demanded purity, loyalty beyond the grave, and silence in the face of longing. The widow was expected to embody her husband's memory, to dedicate her days to the cemetery path, her nights to whispered prayers, and her future to shadow and restraint. Queen Victoria herself, draped in endless black for Prince Albert, set the standard for a nation, that grief was to be both public and permanent. Our widow seemed to follow that very script. Each Sunday she entered the church shrouded in sombre hues, her hands clasping a well-worn Bible, her lips murmuring hymns of devotion. Each morning she walked to the graveyard, her black skirts dragging through the dew, her gloved hand tracing the name etched into her husband's headstone. And each evening she sat alone at her parlour window, candlelight flickering against her pale face, the townsfolk watching from behind their curtains, whispering about her remarkable devotion. To them she was a monument of loyalty. To her children, she was an angel of sorrow. But only she knew the hollowness inside, that her grief, so carefully displayed, was stitched with a secret she dared never reveal. To understand her world, you must step back into the 19th century, where the role of a widow was both exalted and suffocating. In those days, grief was not private. It was public theatre. A widow was judged not only by her prayers, but by the depth of her attire, the weight of her jewellery, the silence of her steps. Black crepe dresses, heavy veils that smothered the light, mourning brooches woven from the hair of the departed, these were her uniform. Society measured her devotion in years, not months. First came deep mourning, when she was cloaked entirely in black, forbidden even a hint of colour. Then half mourning, when muted shades of grey and lavender were cautiously introduced. It was a ritual as rigid as the church bells that marked each passing hour. No figure embodied this more than Queen Victoria, who, after the death of Prince Albert in 1861, spent the remaining 40 years of her reign in mourning attire. Her grief became the model for a generation. If the Queen herself refused to remove her veil, how could any ordinary widow dare to lift hers? But beneath this reverence lay suspicion. A widow was watched as much as she was pitied. Her neighbours would whisper, "Will she remarry too soon? Does she truly grieve? Or is her heart wandering where it should not?" For in a world ruled by appearances, the widow's purity was her currency. To falter, to stray, to love again too quickly, was to risk being branded a scandal. And so our widow learned to play her part. She knew the steps of the performance well. The bowed head at funerals, the hollow smile at christenings, the solitary walks past rows of weathered headstones. She bore her sorrow like armour, convincing all who looked upon her that she was the very model of Victorian virtue. Yet not all lives fit neatly into society's scripts. Some hearts burned too brightly to be bound by mourning cloth and whispered rules. And in the stillness of her home, away from the curious eyes of her neighbours, another story was being written, one bound not in black ribbon, but in secrecy, passion, and risk. By daylight, the widow lived the life expected of her. Her days unfolded like clockwork, so regular that the town could set its rhythm by her steps. Each morning she dressed herself in black satin and lace, her veil fastened with a silver mourning pin. She walked slowly down the cobbled lane toward the churchyard, her children trailing dutifully behind her. The sound of her boots against the stone was as steady as the toll of the bell overhead. There, at her husband's grave, she lingered. She placed fresh-cut lilies in the iron urn, her gloved fingers brushing against the cool marble of his headstone. The inscription, "Beloved husband, faithful father, taken too soon," was polished so often it gleamed even in the winter gloom. Townsfolk passing by would lower their hats and murmur, "God bless her devotion." But admiration was always mingled with curiosity. From behind lace curtains, neighbours peeked at her slow return home. Women whispered in hushed tones after Sunday service, remarking how remarkable it was that she had remained so steadfast, never entertaining the company of another man. At the bakery, in the milliner's shop, in pews lined with hymnals, they all marvelled at her constancy. Her parlour became a shrine of memory. Black-draped portraits of her husband watched over her like sentinels. His favourite armchair was left untouched, the indent in the cushion preserved as though he might return at any moment. On the mantelpiece rested a lock of his hair, woven into a mourning brooch, encased in jet and glass. Even the children were instructed never to disturb it. To the world, her devotion was flawless. She was the ideal widow, quiet, devout, bound forever to the memory of her husband. Her silence spoke louder than words, her solitude a living testament to loyalty. And yet, there were faint murmurs that perhaps her grief was too perfect, that no woman could live so long in shadow without yearning for light. But such whispers were quickly silenced, for who would dare tarnish the sanctity of her mourning? Her devotion seemed unshakable, until, many decades later, long after her own body had been laid to rest, a trunk was opened, and inside it, the truth was waiting. It began with a trunk, an old, dust-covered chest, found in an attic where moths and shadows had been its only companions for decades. Within it lay a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, the ink browned with age, but the passion still pulsing through every word. The letters told a story no one had suspected. A story not of grief and loyalty, but of secret desire. In careful, trembling script, her words unfolded. "My heart beats only when you are near. The nights are endless without your voice. I pray the Lord forgives me, but in your arms I have tasted life again." The handwriting betrayed her. The same delicate hand that had signed parish ledgers and grocery lists, now confessing in candlelit whispers to a love forbidden. Her confidant was no neighbour, no family friend. He was a stranger, a travelling salesman who passed through town with cases of fine linens and perfumes, the sort of man who stirred gossip merely by existing. He was charm-wrapped in a tailored coat, a man who spoke of places far beyond their small Victorian streets. To a widow bound in mourning, his presence must have seemed like sunlight breaking through iron bars. They met in secret. A carriage waiting at dusk beyond the churchyard. A hurried glance exchanged by lamplight. A pressed flower slipped between the pages of a Bible, its meaning understood only by them. Their love was desperate, fleeting but alive, so alive it threatened to consume the life she had so carefully built. The letters spoke of longing, of meetings stolen between storms, of moments when propriety crumbled beneath the weight of human need. He wrote to her, "Though the world believes you belong to shadows, you are my dawn. Your veil hides what your eyes cannot. I would risk ruin for another hour in your presence." And there was more. Whispers of a child, born months after the salesman's final departure. A child raised beneath her husband's name, a child who never knew the truth of the blood running through his veins. For the widow, the affair was a dangerous balancing act. Her public image one of immaculate devotion, her private reality a burning secret that could destroy her family. Each Sunday she stood before the congregation, her lips reciting psalms, her eyes cast downward. But her heart was elsewhere, bound to words inked on paper, hidden away in the shadows of her home. Her neighbours saw a saint, but her letters revealed a woman who defied the script written for her, who dared to love in silence, and who buried her passion as carefully as she buried her husband. He never knew. Her husband lived and died believing he was the center of her world. To the townspeople, he was a man of steady reputation, a shopkeeper respected for his honesty, a church elder whose voice carried firmly in him. His death, sudden and cruel, left the community grieving, but none more, it seemed, than his widow. She stood by his coffin in black lace, her handkerchief damp with tears, her children clinging to her skirts. No one questioned the depth of her sorrow. But while his grave bore the words "faithful father," the truth lay elsewhere. The child he left behind carried not his blood, but the blood of another. A stranger's legacy woven silently into his family's line. Did she feel guilt each time she looked into her husband's eyes across the dinner table? Did she flinch when he kissed her cheek in the lamplight? Or did she bury her guilt so deeply that even she forgot it was there, convincing herself that her secret was mercy, that love had excused the deception? The truth is, Victorian women had little choice. They were bound by silence, their futures tied to duty, reputation, survival. To confess such a sin would have meant ruin, not only for her but for her children. A woman branded in scandal risked losing everything: respect, stability, even her home. And so she kept her silence. She dressed the child in starched white, brushed his hair for Sunday service, and raised him as though he were his father's own. The boy carried his name, inherited his Bible, and grew beneath the proud shadow of a man who never suspected betrayal. By candlelight, when the house was still, perhaps she whispered a prayer of forgiveness. Or perhaps she sat in silence, the letters tucked away in the trunk above, a reminder of what she had chosen and what she had concealed. Her husband's ignorance became her shield, and her silence became her legacy. The truth, fragile, dangerous, was buried alongside him, or so she believed. It happened decades later, long after the widow's own death, when her name had become just another inscription on weathered stone. An attic was emptied, an estate auction prepared, and there, tucked beneath old linens and moth-eaten shawls, someone found the trunk. The latch creaked open, and within lay the letters, bound still with their faded blue ribbon. Hands trembled as the bundle was lifted, dust rising like ghosts into the light. And then the words, her words, came alive again. Page after page, her secret poured out. The devotion to her late husband, so admired by the town, was suddenly cast in a different shadow. The neighbours who once praised her unyielding sorrow now whispered anew. Was her loyalty nothing but performance? Were we fooled by veils and tears? The letters spoke of clandestine meetings by the river, of nights where propriety was discarded for passion, of the ache of separation that lingered even as she knelt at her husband's grave. They revealed not only her affair, but the truth about the child. The boy everyone believed to be his father's heir was, in fact, the living proof of her betrayal. Imagine the descendants, grandchildren, perhaps great-grandchildren, reading those lines for the first time. A family legacy, carefully polished for generations, shattered in an instant. The portrait above the mantel no longer a symbol of purity, but of secrecy. The story of loyalty now rewritten as one of deception. Neighbours, historians, distant relatives, all pieced the fragments together. A respected widow, a vanished lover, an innocent child carrying two shadows. What had once been whispered devotion was now forever branded a scandal. The man she buried never knew, the town said. The man she loved vanished into history. And the child, innocent, carried both men's shadows. Her letters, hidden for decades, had finally spoken louder than her silence. And in speaking, they rewrote everything she had tried so hard to preserve. The candles that once lit her parlour are long extinguished. The veil that shielded her grief has turned to dust. And yet, her secret lingers, woven into every letter she left behind. The widow's secret reminds us that every portrait in a gilded frame, every solemn grave marked with words of devotion, may hide unspoken truths. Behind mourning veils, behind folded hands and whispered prayers, love and betrayal often walk together, quietly, invisibly, beneath the weight of silence. Was she a deceiver? Or was she simply a woman, longing, fragile, desperate to be seen beyond the shadow of loss? Was her devotion false, or was it real in its own way, shaped by duty as much as by desire? If her letters had never been found, her legacy would remain unblemished. She would still be remembered as the model of grief, the saint of loyalty. But with the discovery of those hidden words, we are left with a question. Which memory is truer? The devotion everyone saw, or the confession no one was meant to read? Perhaps her greatest confession was not written in ink at all, but in silence. A silence she carried to her grave, a silence the world mistook for purity, when in truth it was her final, unspoken act of survival. Every generation buries something, truths folded into trunks, locked away in drawers, concealed in diaries that never see the sun. And every so often, those secrets find their way back into the light. Perhaps one day, someone will open your trunk, your letters, your words. What will they discover? And will the story they tell of you be the one you intended?